Thank you for watching our talk. Let me start by thanking the organizers for this event. We think it will be a great event and we're very much looking forward to it. The title of our talk is De Mortuis Nil Nisi Bonum, The Social Lives of the Dead. This is a paper we have jointly written and it's currently under review. And the first thing to do would be to translate the Latin phrase of the title. So it can roughly be translated to speak no ill of the dead. What we want to do in this presentation is argue that the dead counts as a social group. And we will show some of the implications of taking the dead to be a social group for the metaphysics of social groups more broadly. Okay, so I will start by talking about Amy Thomasson's view and her normativity-based criterion of social groups. Then Jacob LiBrizzi will talk about the metaphysics of the dead and the significance of the metaphysics of the dead for the question of whether or not the dead counts as a social group. Then Duccio Calosi will talk about methodological individualism, and he will argue that if we take the dead to be a social group, we cannot be individualists. And then Yoichi Kobe will show that if we take the dead to be a social group, we also cannot be social group internalists. Okay, so we actually came up with this idea for the paper when we were reading Amy Thomasson's The Ontology of Social Groups. So in this paper, Thomasson argues that you can identify social groups by looking at the social norms that are related to the social groups. So she says in this quote, "There are no governing norms for how Genghis Khan and I are both to be treated, nor in our culture for how people with a longer second toe or hazel eyes are to be treated or are to act. There are unfortunately such norms for how people of color and women are to act and be treated. As participants in the social world, we can be blind to these norms and fail to recognize the social groups only at our own peril of sanctions, ostracism, or worse." So Thomasson argues that the entire practical significance of social groups is the social norms that are related to the social groups. And therefore, if you have a random collection of people like Genghis Khan and Amy Thomasson, there are no related social norms, and therefore we shouldn't take it to be a genuine social group. Thomasson identifies three different kinds of social norms. There are external norms, internal norms, and structuring norms. We'll get into those a bit more later. But for now, it's worth pointing out that none of these are necessary for the existence of social groups according to Thomasson. So it's, for instance, not necessary that there be internal norms. There could be social groups that only have external norms. Okay, so we want to argue that if we accept Thomasson's normativity-based criterion, then the dead would count as a social group. And that's because there are a lot of norms related to the dead, such as speak no ill of the dead, do not build on burial grounds. There are norms for funerals, visiting graveyards, etc. And there are two things to note about these norms. One is that they aren't norms about particular people who happen to be dead, but the norms apply to the dead as being dead, as being members of the dead. And the second thing to note is that it doesn't matter for our account that these norms are genuine or well-grounded norms. You could be of the opinion that it's nonsense to speak no ill of the dead, or that these norms related to visiting graveyards are nonsensical. But this does not matter because it's still an empirical fact that these norms are very widespread in our culture and in other cultures. So the same holds for Thomasson for other social groups. For instance, she says in the quote we showed earlier, related to sexist norms, that we can only fail to recognize these norms and the social groups at our own peril. So only at peril of sanctions, ostracism, or worse. And it's exactly the same for the norms related to the dead. Sure, you can not take the norms of visiting graveyards into account, but you do that at your own peril. You do that at the peril of sanctions, ostracism, or worse. Okay, so if we take the dead to be a social group, then there might be an immediate question, which is how could they be a social group if the members of the dead are non-active agents, which they presumably are. We want to argue for this by giving a metaphysical reading of Thomasson's Criterion. So Thomasson argues that by looking at the norms related to social groups, we can identify social groups, but we want to go further and say, no, social groups actually consist in these norms. So we want to say that a social group is a reification of the relevant social norms. And a helpful analogy is money. You can think of money as just a reification of the norms that guide our financial transactions. So without these norms, money is just pieces of paper, but with absolutely no social significance whatsoever. So we can take money as a social entity to just be the reification of the norms associated with money. Okay, now we'll turn to Jacob for the metaphysics of the dead.
Okay, so now we're going to just go really briefly through 6 options that we considered for what the dead might be, and see if any of those options really poses a problem for our view or not. So if you look at options 1 through 3, they all share a common presupposition, and that is that whatever the dead are, they exist. So whatever they are, there's something that exists. So either with position 1, if you want to claim that we, in some robust sense, survive death, you could say that the dead are active persons in the sense of leading lives. They think, choose, perform actions, etc. If that's too much, if you could look at 2, which an example of 2 is Patrick Stokes' view, which is that the dead remain persons, but they're no longer active. They lose, through death, they lose their person-specific capacities, if you will. This includes thinking, acting, leading lives, etc. Another option would be 3, that the members of the dead are inanimate entities. To see an example of this, you could look to Timothy Williamson's project, such that when we're alive, we are in the world as concrete persons, and that through death, we lose that concreteness, and we become non-concrete entities. And so in this sense, with this option, the dead are all around us. It's just that they're non-concrete. Going forward, with the options, we said, well, okay, well, what if the dead are around in some sense, but they don't exist? We'll get rid of that presupposition that they exist. So if you wanted to take on option 4, that the dead are non-existent persons, you could look to the work of Pal Yorgrau, who, like Meinongians, makes a distinction between being and existence. And if you take that distinction on board, you're able to get to the dead as maintaining personhood, but lacking existence. Another option similar to this, but with some differences, would be option 5, that's argued by Neil Connolly, in which the dead are things that no longer exist. They're around when they no longer exist, but they also lose their personhood. And the general idea there is that through death, you lose all of you no longer instantiate the properties that made you a person. So that's also an option. Finally, 6 is the option that the dead as a social group would have no members. Well, what does this mean? It means that taking on this option would be to claim that the dead are literally nothing. They're not even non-existent objects. So with that said, I'm going to say a little bit about a piece of conceptual framework we're building into our view. So in addition to expanding Thomasson's normative framework, we want to take in this notion of person space by Maria Schechman. And the idea here generally is that as long as you have a foundation, or a social foundation around individuals, for example, institutions, norms, laws, customs, that sort of thing, that we actually we afford those individuals personhood status. And so the metaphysics of what they actually are, it becomes kind of irrelevant as long as those norms, those institutions, etc., are widespread enough and that we treat them as persons as such. Okay, so do any of these, the 6 that we talked about, really pose a problem? We don't think so, because even if the dead, whether the dead are existing or non-existing, as long as we can reference the dead, we can point to them in our normative and linguistic practices, we can still rely on that notion of person space and give them personhood status. The only exception to this will be where if position 6 turns out to be true, such that if it were the case that it was widely accepted that the dead are nothing, not even non-existent objects, and if that was considered, that was accepted widespread across various cultures, that we would no longer have the norms that, according to Thomasson's framework, substantiate the dead as a social group. Good news is that this position is not a problem, we don't think, for us, because it's not widespread. I mean, as an empirical fact, there are norms, there are institutions, there are laws surrounding the dead. And because of that, we think that it's not a huge problem for our view. Lastly, just to say that this position is also problematic internally to itself, because it will have the problem of explaining reference. It would be an open question. If I believe that the dead are literally nothing, then the sentence, "I am my grandmother's grandson who is deceased," my grandmother's deceased, makes no sense, because it's kind of very unclear as to how those relations and reference work there. So with that said, I think we're still in kind of like a good, strong position that regardless of what we take the dead to be, that we can still conceive of the dead as a social group. And with that, I give it over to Duccio.
Very nice. Thank you, Jacob. So until now, what we did is to show that the dead should be considered as a genuine social group. And now it's time to change pace and to see how this conclusion impacts our general views on social ontology. And we're going to do that by addressing 2 important points, which are methodological individualism and social group internalism. I'm going to speak about the first. So about methodological individualism, as you see in the first slide, Catherine Ricci defines the idea as the view that social phenomena are to be explained solely in terms of intentions and actions of individual actors. And if this were true, Ricci says, we should cut off social groups from our ontologies. But of course, in the case of the dead, methodological individualism is unavailable, since members of the group of the dead do not have intentions and don't act at all. Hence, we cannot explain social phenomena about them in terms of their intentions and actions. So for us, methodological individualism is a non-starter. But this point is very interesting because it opens up a broader question about whether or not we should consider intrinsic features of individuals as a grounding base for social groups. So for instance, Richard Miller argues that a social group exists only if its members share a psychological identity. But thinking along these lines, that intrinsic features of members of social groups ground social groups may lead to dangerous consequences. For instance, we all agree that it's not because of intrinsic features of women that we treat women badly in our society. And the same can be said about racism and many other instances concerning marginalized minorities. And we suspect that this idea that intrinsic features of individuals ground social groups is driven by the will of some philosophers to provide a ultra-robust ontological status to social groups. And this, we think, is because we usually rely on a problematic realist, anti-realist distinction that leads us to think that the only thing that exists are the natural ones. So to go around this problem, we adopt a threefold division in our social ontology between social naturalism, which is a view like Miller's that social groups exist due to some natural intrinsic features of individuals. Then we have social constructivism, which is the view that social groups exist due to our norms, practices, uses, linguistic utterances, habits, and so on. And then we have social eliminativism, which takes the place of anti-realism of the previous realist, anti-realist division, which says that social groups don't exist at all. And we subscribe together with Searle, Thomasson, Asta, Hacking, and many other philosophers to the view that social groups are grounded not in intrinsic features of individual members of these groups, but in our uses and practices. And thereby we subscribe to the constructivist side of the aforementioned distinction. And we believe that our uses and practices are not grounded on intrinsic features of individuals. So as we say in our paper, instead of appealing to the nature or essence of a social group to explain the related social norms, we should explain the social group in terms of the social norms which are related to it. And this point is absolutely key to understand the practical application of our position. Because if social norms are not grounded of features of members, it's easy to see how they can be unjust. And it's often the case that our norms, practices, uses, and habits lead us to discriminate certain social groups for reasons that have much more to do with cultural heritage than with actual features of members of these groups. And we push this idea to the point where we think that social groups are nothing over and above the social norms that guide our practices towards the members of these groups. So there are social groups can be thought of as reifications of social norms, as we said in the beginning, which do not amount ontologically to anything more than our social practices and the norms that facilitate these practices. But this, given social constructivism, under this light, social groups are still to be considered as existing and useful entities. So getting back to the first point, we are completely on the other side of the spectrum compared to methodological individualism, since for us, intrinsic features of members of social groups are only second to norms and practices in the explanations of what these groups are and what place they have in our social world. And with this, I thank you and I pass the word to Yoichi.
Yes. So another implication that follows from taking the dead as a social group is that it poses a challenge to the view that we call social group internalism. Social group internalism is the view that presence of some kind of elements internal to a collection of people is essential for the existence of for a social group. Seems quite sensible to think that things internal to the members of the group is important for there to be a social group. You take the example of a baseball team, there seem to be some kind of norms that you have to follow qua being a member of a baseball team. And sometimes it's the case that a marginalized group internalize certain kind of expectations and norms that are posed towards them and act according to these posed norms and expectations. And an example of a philosopher who could be considered as a social group internalist would be Gilbert. And according to her view, roughly speaking, a social group is a collection of people that have collectively accepted to do things together as a collective, we or us. But if we start to take the dead as a social group, this clearly contradicts with this kind of social group internalist views, because the dead as a social group clearly exists solely based on external norms, and they clearly lack any kind of internal norms. The dead cannot act and behave on certain norms, nor do they have some kind of shared property that they have together, qua being the dead, and so forth. So this is an interesting implications that follows from our view into challenging one relevant view in the metaphysics of social groups. Yes. So in conclusion, we have used Thomasson's normativity-based criterion for social groups to argue that the dead, in fact, constitutes a social group. And this led, this of taking the dead as a social group, led us to an interesting view about the metaphysics of social group, namely that social groups are in fact reified social norms, nothing less, nothing more. And finally, we discussed the two implications that follows from taking the dead as a social group. It it poses a challenge. It poses a challenge to two relevant view in the metaphysics of social groups. One being a methodological individualism, and the second being a social group internalism. This will conclude our presentation. Thank you very much for listening.